Hello folks, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Chapter 20 of Survivors. Disasters. Reinhard trudged wearily through the ankle-deep snow. All of Moscow was in shambles. Hardly a building in the city had been spared. First, there were meteorites, thousands of them scattered all over Europe, North Africa and the Middle East, and some parts of Asia. They left craters wherever they hit and caused forest fires over so much of the planet. A cloud of haze had circled the earth, blocking out much of the sun's light. Warm air from the fires had forced precipitation far up into the atmosphere, where the moisture froze and refroze until it became huge hailstones weighing up to a kilogram apiece. Thousands died when the giant balls of ice finally rained down on the population. Whole cities were left without roofs. Cars by the millions were smashed beyond repair. Animals lay dead everywhere. Then there was a big one, the asteroid itself. It landed in the mid-Atlantic, sending 100-meter high tidal waves across the ocean, completely swamping the most coastal cities. Millions were lost on the east coast of South and Central America and the west coast of Africa and Europe. The second wave of meteorites or falling stars was worse than the first, although they were all part of the same galactic storm that had been flying through space for eons. In Russia, they were calling the disaster Chernobyl because of its radioactive composition. Radiation levels were dangerously high in a third of the Earth's water supplies. And the problem was so widespread that most people had little choice but to drink the contaminated water, even knowing that it would cause cancers, birth defects and early deaths. It was often a choice between drinking it or dying of thirst. Rayford and Chaim had predicted it all, and Deng Xiao and the Pope Pius had done what they could to hush it up when they had learned that the asteroid was really on its way. Right up to the last, the experts were reportedly saying were reported as saying that the chances of a direct hit were extremely small. They started with figures like 1 chance in a million. And the day before the first meteorites fell, they were still saying that there was only 1 chance in 10 that it would be a direct hit. By the time the seriousness of the situation became clear, it was too late to evacuate most cities. And now Deng Xiao's brave New World Order was in total disarray. It was because of his hatred for the Tribulation Force, whom Deng Xiao also assumed were the 144,000 tribal members, that this had happened in the first place. It has started with Rayford and Chaim declaring drought on Israel that would continue until Deng Xiao ceased his plans to execute believers. The rain stopped and did not fall for the next 3 days, but it did not stop preparations for the executions. Then the 2 prophets promised that the drinking water would be cursed in the next city where an execution took place. The execution started in Amman, Jordan, with more than 100 believers killed the first day. However, the same day, 2 monkeys were found dead in the town's water supply after having escaped from a circus. Subsequent tests revealed that they had died from the Ebola virus, and a deadly epidemic broke out, which ended in all of Jordan being quarantined to contain it. Interestingly, executions in Jordan ceased, and there were no further executions of believers there throughout the final 3 years. Of course, it was hardly a place of refuge, as deaths from the virus were as prevalent as were executions elsewhere. But Deng Chao had bellowed out his anger against the believers even more than the Amman incident. Executions started in earnest around the world over the next few days. In the space of a month, more than 1 million one-handed believers had been beheaded. And that was when the two witnesses decreed that the asteroid would hit. Deng Chao and Pius, both who stubbornly refused to look at the 12 Tribes website themselves, as though fearful that it would brainwash them, received regular reports on it from their advisors. When they had been informed about the asteroid prophecy, they put the observatories on alert around the world. Observatory personnel were told to keep information secret from the media and from other members of the public, but it did not work completely. The press got the story 5 days before the asteroid hit. Nevertheless, it was still too late for the public to do much about it. Now here was Reinhard, trudging through the snow in Moscow, on his way to the safe house, which had been damaged by the hailstones. It would be his job to organize repairs. Sheila Armitage was too old to understand such tasks, and so the hard work always left for Reinhard to do. First it was Rayford, when he had spent so much time teaching, only to have him take over the stage and directing the Jessens. Reinhard had done his best to accept it humbly at the time, but it wasn't much fun being left out the literature. It wasn't much fun being left out to get the literature on the streets while Rayford went on teaching as though everything he said was his own ideas. Then it was Sheila. People just naturally turned to her for counsel in preference to himself because she was almost twice as old as him. And lately it had been Jerry, one of the first recruits for the tribe of Asher, who was commanding more respect from the tribal members than what Reinhard himself was getting. Sure enough, when he arrived, Jerry, a strong, handsome man in his 60s, with long white hair and a beautiful white beard, already had everyone working hard at repairing and reconstructing the safe house, while neighbours pulled off damaged roofing so they could replace it with plastic sheeting or other materials purchased from government stores. Jerry's workers scoured the streets for the best of the discarded bits to be used in repairing their own accommodation. Materials were already coming in, and it would not be long before the snow, at least, would be kept out of their living quarters. Come in, Jerry said kindly when Reinhard gave the secret knock and Jerry had unlocked the door. Ivan, get some coffee for our brother, the ex-American said in perfect Russian. I do not need coffee. I do not need coffee, Reinhard said abruptly. I am here to work. Certainly, Jerry said politely. Then he looked Reinhard in the eye. Is something bothering you? Nein. Nothing is bothering me, Reinhard snapped. Is something bothering you? Well, yes, I guess it is, Jerry said. Can we go in the back to talk properly? What's wrong with talking right here, where we are? Reinhard asked as he sank deeper into the soft chair, his hands extended full length of both arms. I didn't want to embarrass you, Jerry replied almost in a whisper. I think you're upset about something and I wanted to discuss it in private, just you and me. Reinhard picked himself up and threw his body towards the back room. I didn't want to embarrass you, he thought to himself. Typical of the smooth-talking Jerry Anthony. He just naturally assumed that he was right and that all of his lackeys would agree with him. Does it bother you that I'm leading here? Jerry asked. He had been noticing the problem for several weeks and it was time to address it. Maybe, Reinhard said, with a shrug of his shoulders, eyebrows and lips to indicate the insignificance he supposedly placed on the issue. Please, can I share something with you? Jerry asked. Suit yourself, Reinhard replied, pretending to show no interest. As he leaned against the counter in the tiny workroom and looked at the floor. Before the war in America, I had what I thought was a good job. I saw myself as a good leader, but it took the war and the deaths of a lot of innocent people to make me see that my ideas were all wrong. A fancy title does not make a good leader. I came here to Moscow a lost and broken man, but when I met you, Reinhard, and Jerry paused for effect. When I met you, I knew that I had found someone who was a true leader. You had no recognition as far as the world was concerned. No pay, no title, but you knew where you were going. You knew how to tell the important issues from the trivial ones. And you inspired me to try once more to be a true leader. Reinhard had been caught completely off guard. He had expected a rebuke from the older man. Instead, he had been flattered. It did more than any rebuke could have done to humble the young man. It had been a long time since Reinhard had received such a warm compliment, and he knew himself that what Jerry was saying about the true leadership was right. Being a good leader did not depend on getting compliments or other positive recognition. It had more to do with catching sight of something that others were not aware of. What Jerry has said was enough to bring back the vision to What Jerry had said was enough to bring back the vision to one who had let his flame go dim. Reinhard had seen others in the 12 tribes lose their vision of eternity and heaven and the return of Jesus, and they had each turned back. Some of them had been very good leaders before they had fallen away. He shuddered to think that he had been heading the same way himself. He reached out to hug the older man. Danke, he said, for Jerry knew German too. Danke, Jerry. Please, forgive me for my bad manner. Reinhard had been busy since he arrived in Moscow, more than 4 weeks earlier. Reinhard had been very busy since he arrived in Moscow, more than 4 years earlier, but it was no excuse for his failure to have ever really shared deeply with this man who had been such a great help to the movement for more than 3 years, and who had just spoken the exact words that were needed to bring Reinhard out of his spiritual nosedive. Tell me about yourself, Reinhard said, in an effort to make up for the sins of his past. How did you come to Moscow, of all places? We did not have much choice, Jerry explained. I hid out in America for several weeks, but when a helicopter finally came to pick up survivors, it turned out to be a Russian one. We were brought here, and I have been here ever since. And what about your family? Reinhard asked. I had a daughter and a son, both living in New York City. They were near the center of the blast. They would have died instantly. And your wife? My wife, Jerry asked blankly. She... I have never talked about it. Maybe this would be a good time to start, Reinhard suggested kindly. Jerry hesitated once again. It was clear that he wanted to talk, but something was holding him back. I do need to talk about it. Can you keep this just between you and me? It's very important. Certainly, Reinhard agreed. My wife was killed, not by the bomb. She was killed by an assassin in front of my eyes. Jerry's voice was already breaking, but he wanted to finish his story. It was obviously something that he had kept inside for quite some time. He meant to kill me too, he sobbed. Hank Greenhorn, one of my security men, he threw himself in front of me. He never had a chance. Jerry sat on the floor and put his hands in his face, sobbing quietly as he spoke. Reinhard listened in amazement. Security men? Assassins? What was he talking about? The explosion deafened me for a while. I was so traumatized that I could not speak. No one else got out of the bunker alive. When the Russians arrived, I knew I couldn't use my real name. So I used my middle name instead, Gerald Anthony. My beard had already begun to grow, and so I kept it long, along with the long hair. Reinhard joined Jerry on the floor and reached out to hug him. Whatever the man was talking about, he was clearly deeply disturbed. How could God ever have forgiven me? He wept, wiping his nose with a handkerchief. How could I have been so heartless? I let my own political ambitions become more important than the lives of all those people. I saw my error too late. I couldn't save America, but thank God I didn't push the button to destroy them. Reinhard was still trying to make sense of what Jerry was saying. How could Jerry Anthony, or Jerry whoever, he was thinking, that he had caused the fall of America? He pushed the old man's hair back from away from his face and studied his features. His hair had gone completely grey, possibly from what he had been through. But under the beard, Reinhard thought he could recognize him now. "Fitzhugh?" he asked. Jerry nodded. Reinhard could hardly believe it. He was sitting on the workroom floor, hugging the former president of the United States. The man was a bit older, and he wore long hair with a beard now, but it was the president. A suicide bomber, perhaps one of his own security men, must have entered the president's bunker under the White House, along with him and the First Lady. The President of the United States had just told Reinhard that it was Reinhard who had taught him what it meant to be a leader, and he had said it after having worked quietly under Reinhard's leadership for more than 3 years. What an amazing compliment, and how foolish of him to have worried because he was not getting the recognition that he thought he had deserved. Truly, what God had called him to do was more important than being the president of the most powerful country in the world. President Gerald Fitzhugh himself knew that. And what they were doing was important, even if Reinhard was not the most widely recognized member of this new kingdom. Reinhard prayed for strength to stay faithful with even the humblest job, and he thanked God for the privilege being able to serve in such an important movement. So all this time, like, Reinhard's getting upset that the limelight's been stolen away from him. He's not important anymore. People keep going to other people for advice and for the word. And all this time, the Most High has placed him right in front of the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, as they say. And this guy's been humbled, and now he's learning from Reinhard. And Reinhard, he didn't know, he didn't have a clue. The Most High works in mysterious ways. And while we're all in our feelings, thinking about ourselves, we don't have a clue what's going on in other people's lives, behind the scenes, and what they're hiding from us, what they won't show us. In contrast, Dang Chao and Pius were tortured men, spinning out of control in their obsession to maintain control of the world. Pius had almost become as demonic as Dang Chao now, having learned how to perform a few sensational tricks with the help of Dang Chao's supernatural powers. Pius would unashamedly prostrate himself on the ground in front of the statue whenever walking through the temple complex now. And he had started bowing to Dang Chao and using grandiose titles for him. That became further evidence of his worship for this man-beast. The statue had arrived. The statue had survived the disasters, but both temples had been damaged. But both temples had been damaged by the hailstorm. A meteorite had destroyed Pius's personal residence when the first shower hit. Fortunately, he had not been there when it struck. "We must stop them," Dang Chao spluttered as he was eating lunch with his cohort. "We must find their headquarters, kill their two witnesses, as they call them. If we don't, they will continue to grow. Torture will do it. Someone must know. They'll tell us where it is." "But your worship," Pius replied, torture takes time. "It will slow down the executions, and everyone is needed for rebuilding. It takes a lot of infrastructure just to ferret them out to begin with. There are interviews with informers, office staff to maintain records, arresting officers, executioners. Even the morgues are overcrowded with these latest disasters. Damn the disasters. Let them lie where they are. If we don't stop these Christians, everything else will be wasted. Skip the red tape too. If an informer even thinks that someone is connected with the movement, I want that person killed. I don't care whether they have the mark or not. There must be people on the inside helping them. We must find them and make examples of them." Dang Chao continued. "The people can rebuild later. All of our energies must be put into stopping these Christians. If we don't do that, there won't be a world to rebuild." So now Christians are to blame for all the disasters and all that's happened. That's why we're telling you now. We're telling you exactly what's happening. Prophecy's coming. It's not our fault. It's your world leaders' fault. Okay? It's not our fault. No excuses when this all starts to play out. You made your choice. By not making that choice now, you make your choice, you make your bed, you lie in it. But you know, that's not what the human, that's not how humans deal with things, you know. People don't like to admit they're wrong. People want comforting lies, not the uncomfortable truth. We know. And also, while the world looked on, shocked in disbelief, their great leader, the man they had all thought as recently as a year ago was the greatest leader the world had ever known, chose to ignore their suffering because of his own obsession with getting back at Christians. Deng Chao had convinced himself that it was the Christians who were destroying the world. And he used his best speechwriters and press secretaries to get that message out across to the masses. Please don't do it, Krishnan, Channel 4 News. Don't do it. We like you, Christian, because Krishnan. We like you because you've been giving us the news since we were children. And I like the way you gave it to the politicians yesterday for their nonsense. But when this starts, just conveniently retire like Jon Snow did. Jon Snow, the man who exposed the swine flu nonsense, he conveniently retired at the time when they were rolling out the lollipop, the snake oil, the clock shot in 2021. You respect that old man. He used to sit there on the train reading his newspaper. It's conveniently, I didn't say nothing, he conveniently retired at the time where they were rolling out the vaccine. And I conveniently remember that he was the man who did a report about the swine flu hoax. Sorry, off track there. Just thought I'd slip that in there. Deng Chao had convinced himself that it was the Christians who were destroying the world, and he used his best speechwriters and press secretaries to get the message across to the masses. He's succeeding in whipping up such a hysterical hatred for Christians and such a paranoia about their supposed conspiracy against the rest of the world that soon neighbors were turning on one another and turning them in for execution on the flimsiest of evidence. Executions increased tenfold. But 8 out of 10 of the people being killed now were the ones who bore the mark in their very much intact right hands. Doesn't that sound so familiar? He succeeded in whipping up such a hysterical hatred for anti-vaxxers and such a paranoia about their supposed conspiracy against the rest of the world that soon neighbors were turning on one another and handing each other over on the flimsiest of evidence. Executions increased tenfold, but 8 out of 10 of the people being killed were now the very ones who had the mark themselves. It's funny. It's funny. Very, very funny. Because you see what they're doing now, red pilled friends, brothers and sisters. All of those very conspiracy minded people. You see what they're doing. You've seen them do it with the TV shows now. And we've got one very recent one over here in Britain, which is on Sunday nights, where they turn all our issues and they turn people like us into terrorists. I'm sure they've done it on your crime shows such as Law and Order and FBI. They're doing it on our crime shows now, like Trigger Point. There was one scene that it was just, I just had to laugh because I saw exactly what they were doing, right? There's this bomb disposal woman, right? And she's come to check out a lift to see if there's a bomb in there. And everyone climbs out of the lift, but there's one guy who's supposed to be red pilled, like, and he's refusing to move. And he's like, oh, I'm not going anywhere. You lot aren't going to control me. This is what you do, don't you? Bomb scares and vaccines to control us. And I thought, oh, this is so dumb. This is so dumb. They're just using these programs to mock us and to place thoughts into the NPC's head. I've adopted that now, NPCs, because that hits the nail on the head. Just like red pill hit the nail on the head. Just like woke hit the nail on the head. These sayings, they hit the nail on the head. That's why they try to change them. So I'm going to start using NPCs because everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say NPCs. They started putting us people who know, so that when we start speaking about these things, you know, these issues, we know what they are. When we start exposing them, they've already put out a TV series and characters in that TV series to make you sound exactly like them, so people's minds just automatically, unconsciously and subconsciously don't take you seriously and start to mock you and say you've seen too many movies. And that's how you know you're an NPC, if you immediately do that and say, oh, conspiracy theorist. Now they're trying to make us look dangerous. Unbelievable. Do you see it now? Are you awake yet? The effect of Dan Chow's rage was to encourage even more of his faithful followers to defect. If they were going to die anyway, they reasoned, it would be better to die on the side of right. And the two witnesses could not resist echoing the timeless wisdom of such reasoning. Excuse me. If we are all going to die anyway, they said, then how much better to die for God than to die for this demon? This has been common sense behind the gospel's message for centuries, whether or not the world happens to be falling apart around us. End of chapter. Zion Ben Jonah writes, the disasters that are heralded by the first four trumpets, of the Great Tribulation, Revelations 8, 6-12, are mentioned in this chapter. It is interesting that the word Chernobyl is the Russian name for the poisonous wormwood plant. The passage from Revelation 8 says that the asteroid that hits the earth will be called wormwood. Now, in our financial sector, in our square mile in London, we've got a road called Wormwood Street. And it's in a very you know, kind of place. And I don't, why they name, it just triggered me off. Like reading the Bible and learning more, and then being reminded of that place, Wormwood Street, and the Great Fire of London, 1666. And in that area, there's a lot of bodies in the soil. Oh man, it's just too much. Like, just the mind. Like, yeah. This chapter also this chapter also reveals a little more of the powers that the two witnesses will be able to wield. Read about them in Revelations 11. The main lesson, however, is that the leadership, the beastly systems of the world all jostle for power, wealth, fame, and honor. But the humble, sacrificial death of the Lamb is what characterizes the kingdom of heaven. What a shame that Constantine did not have the opportunity to learn, as Fitzhugh does in this chapter, what it means to be a true leader in the kingdom of heaven. Only when that happens will people understand it would be better for the leaders of the most powerful countries and empires in history to be humble missionaries and servants in the kingdom of heaven than to supposedly use their power to bring favors for God and for his people. Pious represents the tragic end that befalls those who refuse to leave their positions of power along with everything else that God calls us to do in order to enter his kingdom. I'll leave it there.